Hello, and welcome to the UBC Center for Migration Studies Narratives Group's lecture series and Dr. Shauneen Pete's virtual visit to my son's 202 classroom, a course which explores Indigenous survivance and misrepresentation in what is now considered Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe. My name is Biz Nidam, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies, speaking to you currently from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today's talk is part of a lecture series I've co-organized to coincide with my course that invites Indigenous scholars, entrepreneurs, and activists to speak on issues that relate to our course material and lead conversations at the intersection between Indigenous studies and European studies. Supported by my department, the UBC Center for Migration Studies, and a Diversity and Inclusion grant from the Waterloo Center for German Studies, this speaker series began last semester with a documentary film screening of Drew Hayden Taylor's Searching for Winnetou and a conversation with the Anishinaabe author, humorist, and documentary film director. And featured last week a talk by Dr. Renee Watchman of McMaster University. Upcoming events include a workshop with Indigenous entrepreneurs and board game experts David Plamondon and Jade Gravel of Pomeroy Consulting, who will introduce students to issues surrounding Indigenous representation in transnational board game culture. In a conversation with Indigenous social worker and researcher Kita Glachu of the University of Calgary, who will present her work on decolonizing Disney. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land upon which our class meets every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 1 p.m. on the west coast of what is now called Canada, and specifically from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam. This land has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who since time immemorial have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. And even though this particular conversation is taking place in virtual space and reaching an audience across Canada, it is important to me as a settler scholar raised on and around this land to begin this particular event with an expression of gratitude to the historic and contemporary caretakers of the land on which I work, learn, and teach. Moreover, as part of our coursework, my students, many of whom are settlers themselves, have also been contributing to our daily practice of acknowledging the land upon which we meet, as well as the land that has been quite literally the foundation of their lives across Canada and around the world. So I'd like to take a moment to invite one of my students to share their land acknowledgement. I invite Emily Chen to turn off her mic and allow to talk. There we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia's Point Grey campus, the land we are virtually learning on as of late, is built upon the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to further recognize that I'm currently speaking to you from my home, where I have been personally living and remotely learning in what is now called Richmond, British Columbia, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Now, for those of you who may not be as familiar with the island city of Richmond, it is commonly known for its popular tourist attractions such as Steveston and Garry Point Park. However, before those attractions came about, it was home to many of the Musqueam people who built settlements along the river, giving them access to an abundance of resources and the ability to practice fishing. Since then, the Musqueam people have been forcibly removed and commercial fishing industries have taken over. This demonstrates only one out of a multitude of unjust actions that the Musqueam people have experienced. As a frequent visitor to the aforementioned areas, I never stopped to think about the stories embedded within the land I stood on. Thus, the importance of educating myself on all that is left unsaid has become more apparent than ever. Today, according to the city of Richmond, there is still one remaining First Nations bunkhouse located in Steveston, and as of last year, discussions around rebuilding it have arisen. Looking forward, I hope that you will join me in listening to the stories that are waiting to be told, as I believe this is the beginning of a long journey to restore the rich history of the land of the Musqueam people. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Now, before I turn this event over to Dr. Pete, I'd like to share some details on the virtual event and introduce our speaker. First of all, this Zoom webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the UBC Center for Migration Studies website after today's talk. Dr. Pete will spend about 40 minutes presenting her research, which is entitled Restoring Higher Education Toward Indigenous Resurgence and Settler Decolonization. And then I will open the floor for questions. Please pop your questions into the Q&A for me to pose or raise your hand so that I can unmute you so that you can ask your question personally. We will endeavor to get to as many questions as possible within the time available to us, though I apologize in advance if we're not able to address all inquiries. My students will be departing at 1:50 p.m. to attend their next class, but we'll keep this Zoom webinar event going for an additional 10 or 15, maybe 20 minutes for questions from other participants in attendance today, before I also have to head to my next class. However, in the event that participants want to continue the conversation, I'll hand my hosting responsibilities over to my colleague, Dr. Marcus Hollandsleben. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest. Dr. Shauneen Pete is a professor of leadership studies at the University of Victoria from Little Pine First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. Shauneen is also a mother and grandmother. Her research and teaching promote the indigenization and decolonization of higher education, working towards settler decolonization in teacher education. She has served as the executive lead in indigenization at the University of Regina. She was also the vice president and interim president at First Nations University of Canada. So thank you again, Shauneen, for joining us today. Please take it from here.
Thank you so much, Biz. And thank you, Emily, for the land acknowledgement that you offered. I hear great authenticity in your voice and a deep understanding and respect for the location where you currently are studying and going to and living. Tanse, Dr. Shauneen Pete, Nitsikosan, from Little Pine First Nation in Treaty 6 territory. On my father's side, I'm from Little Pine, and we're Cree speaking people there. And on my mother's side of the family, I'm from Cowsas First Nation, that's in Treaty 4 territory, and they are Dakota, Cree, and Nakaway people. My connection to these nations is very different because I grew up as an urban Indian in both Regina and in Saskatoon. I attribute my emerging understanding to both indigenization and decolonization primarily to my father, Jacob Pete. My father passed away just over a year ago. And one of the teachings that he offered up to me was a story. So I want to begin with that one. So if you're not familiar with the geography of Canada, you can grab your cell phone and you can take a look at a map in North America if you need to. And you'll notice that kind of in the central plains of Canada and the US, there's that border south of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And if you look really closely right below the border, you're going to see the Missouri River. And that it forms the backdrop for this story. A long time ago. A long time ago, there was a gathering of 10,000 teepees on the banks of the Missouri River. Can you imagine that? 10,000 teepees with people from different nations gathering in this place, some of them Blackfoot and some of them Cree and some of them Dakota people and many other nations represented in that location. And as the teepees were set up, the spiritual leaders came together to the council fire and they began to set the tone for the gathering that was going to be taking place. They said, maybe your people can sing your songs in this morning and we'll finish the evening off with these songs, and that we'll begin with prayer in this way and we'll conclude our gathering in this other way. And so they negotiated back and forth and ensured that each participant was able to contribute to the ceremonial aspects of the gathering. You can also imagine that the warriors would also meeting and they would gather together to talk about land and what had been happening between different nations, maybe some concerns that they had. They might have talked about what had happened in terms of weather. Were there fires, were there floods in the areas, and they would trade that information back and forth. And the women leaders would gather too, and the women would come together and they would, be reunited with childhood friends and family members, and there was a great deal of affection. Keep in mind that these people from many nations were intercultural and multilingual, and so their connections with one another across nationhood were very much tied together through kinship. The women would come forward and they would share with each other what their needs were in their community. For example, maybe there was a small number of young people who were, getting older and it was time for them to become partnered. And so the women would negotiate back and forth about the qualities of young people and the gifts that they brought. And they were mindful too about what was needed in their own community or in that community over there. And so the negotiations around uniting the nations through partnerships in this way were also very much talked about. In other circles and in other camps, people would gather together and they would trade. And so you can imagine the laughter and the joking and the storying that was going on in that place. Your people maybe had the access to the flint that was going to be needed over here. And so there was bartering and discussion, and it was a really robust kind of communication and really quite dynamic. And between some nations, there were tougher negotiations and discussions. The fires that had, devastated your wintering place might require you to winter in this other place, but that puts you in proximity to these two nations. And so you would very, very much understand that you're asking to share the land, not to occupy it and own it, but to borrow it for a time. And you can imagine that all of these interactions reinforce the relationships and the relationality of the participants. And in a good way, they would finish off the ceremony with ceremony and send each other off in a good way, looking forward to the next time that we would gather. At the core of this story is the teaching of Wekotowin, and Wekotowin means that we are all related. And what's not taken up in the story is that those relationships that were spoken to go beyond the human to human or to intertribal kind of relationality, and extends to the land and extends to the plants and extends into other forms of non-human life form, including all the winged ones and the earth movers and the two-leggeds and the four-leggeds, like all of the creatures, all living things have become related. My personal four-legged over there is shaking away, so he's making a good deal of noise. So Wekotowin means that we're all related, and there's the secondary teaching that works in alignment with it called Wetaskowin, and it means we choose to live together in a good way, and that it's a very active decision of negotiation, of understanding, of sharing of the resources and of the lands that have been gifted to us by Creator. These two teachings for Cree people are foundational to all of our relations, and they form the very central part of our worldviews. As someone who grew up in an urban setting and who was very strongly encouraged to go to university by my parents, I wanted to go to university so that I could learn more about our shared history in this country. A history that had really been erased in my own schooling experience in the city. I didn't have my first Indigenous teacher until I started university, and it wasn't even until my third year that Dr. King became my teacher. And prior to that, everyone that I had learned from was settler, and their worldviews were embedded in how they taught, and it was embedded in the assumptions they made, and those types of things. And I wanted to better understand what it meant to be Cree, what it meant to be urban, what it meant to be able to have the knowledge to transfer into to my own children and to my grandchildren. I often found that as an urban middle-class person, that I was observing how whiteness operated. So growing up in our middle-class neighborhood, we were often the only Indigenous people in the community and in the school. And I noticed lots of things about whiteness and white middle-classness that I thought were a little weird. So for example, like, you don't walk on people's grass in the suburbs, like just don't do that, that's not allowed. There was a real protectionism, an invisible barrier even between the house and the street, right? Like you just didn't cross across the grass. The ideas of possessions were so strange. In visiting other people's houses as a child growing up, I noticed how people like to collect things in those white middle class houses. They collected the spoons and they collected the teacups and stuff like that. And I thought, what is that about? What is that? In comparison, when my grandmother passed away, we mark a person's passing through giveaway, and we demonstrate our generosity and our ability by giving away all of our possessions. And so it's not about receiving gifts, it's actually about giving away of gifts in a way to support both Wekotowin and Wetaskiwin again. These two teachings are really central, like as I said, to our worldview and how we think about our relationships with one another. And thinking about our relationships with the land plays into this. And thinking about land, because land is central to the colonial project, right? And so land has to be recentered in terms of decolonization. I know that some of you are familiar with Robin Wall Kimmemer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And Dr. Kimmemer speaks to how dominant worldviews really position land as a commodity. And it reduces land to materiality and possession in a way that erases kinship ties to land. It's such a different way of thinking, and it helps us to understand how dominant groups can then exploit land and take advantage of it and fight for it. But that's not the way that we were a long time ago. As Indigenous people, our teachings were more about, here's our shared relations. How can we all work together in a way that benefits, that's mutually beneficial and mutually respectful across the lines. It's the core idea of these two different worldviews and their view on land that is really core to some of the tensions that we experience today. And in university, many students who've come into my class are surprised by my first question to them. On the beginning of every class I've taught for the past 20 years, I've always asked, how did you learn about Indigenous people in your home, school, and community? And the answer hasn't really changed much. I spent most of my career up until 2017 in Saskatchewan, teaching at the University of Saskatchewan, University of Regina, and at First Nations University of Canada, and being a guest lecturer across Canada on these themes. And in responding to the question, how did I learn about Indigenous people in my homeschooling community? Most students don't have much to say. They didn't have a whole lot of content about Indigenous people. They remember some discussion in grade 5 about the Riel resistance. Sometimes they might have had a place-based experience, but for the most part, they didn't have that real clear understanding of our collective histories. And nor did they have a whole lot of relationships with Indigenous people, except in the case where their family members might have foster cared Indigenous people, or there were intermarriages. But even then, those stories seem like they're really few and far between. In speaking with new Canadians and international students, their understanding of Indigeneity is equally low. It's not a subject that's usually used in the recruitment documents for the university. Come and meet our Indigenous people in our province and learn more about their histories and contributions to society. So these ideas about Indigeneity are actually erased in the formal schooling system, and it's hindered all of us. It's hindered Indigenous people because we don't see ourselves reflected in the formal schooling system, and it's hindered settler people too. In a way that disallows the possibility of reconciliation, because reconciliation requires mutual understanding and mutual respect. And so structurally, these things are absent. So we have a problem, and since 2015, and since the TRC came out, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, we have been told that education is the way forward, but few of us have been really fully prepared to take up that work earnestly. And in universities across Canada, they agreed that they were going to do more, do differently, but they weren't really sure what that meant. On the indigenization side of things, we have to remember that it is a really localized project, one that should engage local Indigenous peoples in a variety of decision-making roles, so that the curriculum and resource allocation decisions and the Board of Governors and the governance structures and our financial allocations and our curriculum and all of those things can be reframed and reformed in a way that benefits not only Indigenous people, but settlers as well. Indigenous resurgence allows for us to challenge our ideas about the location of study. And what you see in Indigenous programming is oftentimes it's delivered in the home community or the communities of origin of Indigenous people. And courses there are taught by Indigenous people, and sometimes even in a most beautiful way in their own languages, which is really exciting, right? Because in those communities, we're cultivating resurgence of both language and culture and identity in a way that will be very powerfully impactful for young people. They're going to come into post-secondary institutions with a very different kind of idea of self and histories and aspirations. So Indigenous resurgence takes on a bunch of different forms. It could be those kinds of courses offered in community, or it could be like at First Nations University of Canada, where the whole university is structured from the starting point of Indigenous worldviews, and then other ways of knowing, more dominant ways of knowing, are added into that thinking of that professional training that's offered there. And so we see some reforms undertaken to support Indigenous learning in really positive ways on campuses. And at the same time, we also have to deal with the majority of the student body, which are primarily settler people or visiting students. And in this structure where they've been structurally denied the opportunity to learn about Indigenous people, their curricular needs are really different. They sometimes, as settlers, will say, I think I need to learn your culture so that I can be in relationship with you. And I'm not so sure that's the answer. Because our cultures for us, so it's for us to know who we are with one another as Indigenous people. And I think what settlers need to understand is the history and the impacts of settler colonialism as it's continued to be maintained, but the histories of colonialism and the way that it has shaped the knowledge base and the knowledge system. So to go back to Robin Wall-Kimmerer's information around land as possession and the idea of land as something that can be traded for other things. It's a measure of wealth, right? The problem is that that idea is so deeply rooted into much of what we are teaching in university, the idea of meritocracy and land ownership, land possession, land exploitation even are embedded into that worldview. And so we have to be really critical of the things that we're learning, even in Canadian literature. How often does the settler colonial story get repeated there without question? And how does that limit all of us in our relations with one another? So universities have been taking up two different kinds of work, certainly the indigenization work, which can include Indigenous resurgence work. And then there's a secondary piece that has to do with settler decolonization. And there are some strategies that I use to help my students who are predominantly white, who are predominantly middle class and Christian in teacher education programs, to help them better understand what their roles and responsibilities will be as educators as they step into the profession. One of the first activities that I have them do is to really begin to get a better sense of where are they and how are they connected to place. And so Emily's example of sharing the land acknowledgement is a really wonderful first step for people. Oftentimes students will say, I've never thought of this before. I've never had to connect myself to this kind of context. And I see my roles and responsibilities a little bit differently now. And the second activity that I often will have them do is around finding a story, because they'll tend to say that they don't have a story about place or land. And so I have them connect with land in a real way, in a way that asks them to embrace land as teacher. And that phrase comes from Leanne Simpson's work. And so I have them do memory work of times when they felt in touch with land and with nature, where perhaps they had a different kind of relationship, and how over time, family and society kind of quieted that connection, or even said that's, that's not real, or what have you. And so I have them do that kind of memory work. And then I have them do embodied learning by going to a place on the land and getting comfortable in that spot. Ask them to find a place where they could sit for like half an hour or so. And I ask them to be engaged in a deep listening practice, where they first observe what's around them and they respond to the beginning sentence that starts, I see. I see the fern, I see the sunshine on the water, I see the butterfly, I see the dragonfly. And to make notes of along the way of what they see. And then again, in a really mindful way, to then say to themselves, I am the butterfly, and I am the fern, and I'm the reflection on the water. And to see what shifts inside, give them some opportunity to write, to create poetry, to draw, to meditate even on this new voice that they're becoming responsive to. After they've done this exercise, I see, I am, students report they feel a shift, like right about here in their head, like something just went on right there. And the next part of the exercise is a bit of a challenge, because I asked them to ask the land, who sent me here today? Who called me here today? And sometimes it's the water, and sometimes it's the cedar tree, and sometimes it's the moss underneath their feet. And in listening to that, it reignites that kind of connection to land that perhaps is just ancestral memory, right? And that's a moving experience for them. And through their debrief on that exercise, they're able to see, they often raise questions about appropriation. Do these exercises mean I'm appropriating Indigenous people's culture? And I'm like, no, they're actually just reigniting your ancestral memory and connections to land that are human driven, right? But they're based on original worldviews. Some of them have limited our ability to connect back to that way of knowing. A third activity I have them do together is a decolonial story of place. So I have students go into their neighborhoods, into their community to find a place, a roadway, a street sign, a building, a park, a waterway, a place, and to do research on both the settler story of that place and the Indigenous story of that place, because students often tell me they don't know what the stories of this place are, what the original stories were. So they can do this, they can do the research, and they can find the answers, and they often educate one another about a different kind of connection to land, the way that settler narratives of land have really shaped us as Canadians, and the way that it's limited us in our thinking about our relations with non-human others. The last activity that I have the students do is another one that has to do with thinking differently about land and land messaging. And I have them consider the reserve system, the pass system, the Indian Act. I have them think about the work of Dr. Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt and their work on restoring land that references the Gerald Stanley case, the Colton Bushy case, and the way that dominant narratives filter through our relationships and hinder relationships today. And what that means then for how we look at Wet'suwet'en or development projects throughout the province. And I have them then look into those cases, what's happening in your community. Where is corporate encroachment into First Nations lands happening. Why does that happen? Why is it allowed to happen? Why is it allowed to persist? Questions that emerged this past week had to do with why was there no police intervention with the trucker convoy, for example, and yet there's police presence at Wet'suwet'en and Fairy Creek, and people are being arrested and put in jail and those kinds of things. And so we have to understand also the ways in which colonialism and settler colonialism continues racism, and that racism is one of those outcomes, or it's a mechanism to enforce and reinforce settler colonialism. So students will often come into my classes and they think they're going to learn my culture, and they're not prepared for this, right? They're not really prepared to actually critically examine the maintenance, the development and maintenance of settler colonialism and how it plays out. And so they're surprised. And they're surprised that I want them to do something very different in their own teaching work. And that work is to expand and advance settler colonialism in K-12 and into other forms of education. In terms of Indigenous resurgence work, I really admire my colleagues in the Indigenous Education Department at UVic, who are really promoting language revitalization in community. I look towards models like the Shinta, where Indigenous people, students are coming together and learning on the land directly with Indigenous peoples and knowledge keepers. I admire the work of Alex Wilson, who has taken graduate students on a tour of the river systems in Manitoba, connecting back to our collective histories and deepening our understandings of those different forms of oppression that led to the kinds of structural oppressions that we have today in a real way. And so there's a great deal of possibility for reforming higher education in Canada by invigorating and advancing Indigenous resurgence, and by taking seriously and advancing settler decolonization. So that's kind of where I want to just end for now, because I think there was lots of gems in there, and I would love to open it up to some conversation and some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of those rich anecdotes about your teaching and how you and your journey and how you got to doing the work that you're doing. I think it was so powerful and connects really well with some of the conversations we've had in my class, but in concrete terms, because I'm often offering readings by Indigenous scholars talking about some of these, but it's different to be hearing about experience and the impact that it has on your students. So I thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
While we open up, I'm going to turn to the audience to see if anybody's going to start popping some Q&A, or students and participants are welcome to raise their hand and I'll turn off their mic. I had one question that that coming out of recent news, and so you're talking so much about relationships to the land, but also how you were an urban Indigenous person growing up in a middle-class neighborhood. And so recently CBC was reporting on First Nations buying up urban land to establish urban reservations or something akin to that. And so I wanted to know what your thoughts on that were, because it's complicated. This land shouldn't have to be purchased. So please.
Yeah, I love it. You know, so much of the land, even after reserve making, so much of the land was clawed back by government. In my mom's reserve, in Kausis's case, the land was appropriated for recreational spaces for settlers in southern Saskatchewan. And so we had land loss and they got land gain. And so there's a real desire to expand and to reclaim the lands that were lost over time, but also to expand our holdings. Because ultimately it's about land, right? And we want to be able to go to ceremony in these spaces, to gather medicines, to gather and hunt. And we're unable to do that oftentimes. I would really love it. I think here in Victoria, there's one family here that has given back their properties back to local First Nations. And so they really are living land back in a really good way, right? And that for them was their act of reconciliation. And you know, that family had roots to the Hudson Bay Company here, and to early settlement, and to merchandising, and like there was a whole bunch of business that was allowed to privilege them, that they understand. And I think that's fantastic. My partner is a settler, and he always says, you shouldn't have to buy back the land. We should just be giving it back to you. And I'm like, well, tell your people. Tell them. That's what we would love.
Yeah. No, but it was really interesting to be reading this particular article, because it's not waiting for this change to happen, even while understanding that First Nations shouldn't have to buy back the land. It's making it happen. And I also read about that family in Victoria returning land to the First Nations community, and I found it very powerful. And just the highlighting of these stories in the news, I think also hopefully promotes change and action, and a different kind of recognition for the evolving relationship with the land of the First Nations community. The land changes, but the relationship stays the same.
Exactly.
Yes. I have one comment from in our Q&A from a participant, not a question at this time, but a deep appreciation for you and your willingness to be so gracious and share your experience and praxis. So just some gratitude from the audience. Does anybody from the audience want to speak to some of these elements? That question that you posed to your students at the beginning, how did you first learn about First Nations culture, might be also really powerful to hear some testimony from our audience. It's something that I start my class with as well. It's difficult to do the sharing that is required in these sorts of conversations. I myself can share a little bit that because I grew up in the Lower Mainland, and I don't recall any education, which is one of the reasons why I gravitated so much to this kind of teaching, because it then became my responsibility as a settler to support this kind of education as best as I can from a settler perspective. So that lack of knowledge was so shocking to me when I returned to Canada, that I decided I had to do something about it. And this is my learning, this is my doing.
And it's so accessible. You know, I'm still surprised sometimes on campus where I have students who say, where do I start? And I'm thinking, Google First Nations people. Google it and see what pops up, and then follow your inquiry. If you're interested in Olympians who are First Nations people, you'll find it. If you're interested in the variety of language groups spoken in BC, you're going to find it. Like, there are so many hits you're going to get, and there's no excuse not to just begin that process. There's never before been more written textual kind of materials. Never before has there been more television networks with Indigenous content. APTN is like one of my favorites. Podcasts and TikToks, and there's just so many different resources and so many access points. There's no excuse not to just begin.
And I also appreciate your comment that relationship building doesn't require complete knowledge of Indigenous culture. It requires a certain level of honesty, vulnerability, and willingness to be open. So hopefully that's
important. It's completely important. I absolutely love when students come forward, or community members come forward, and they'll say, you know, I'm on my learning journey, and I was reading this, and I went to that workshop, and I was listening to this podcast, but I still have a couple questions. Can we would you entertain them? Like, I love that I have a choice. I love that there's, you know, perhaps an offer of reciprocity there, like, I'll buy you a cup of tea. And I also love that people are declaring the work that they've already started with, because it means to me, I'm not starting like with the basics. I've been teaching for 20 years. I've been a teacher for 30 years. And I'm shocked that I still have to explain the difference about Métis, Native, Aboriginal, First Nations. Like, I have to explain those terms still. Again, Google them. Right?
And this terminology is so important. Names and identity, it really is. It's the foundational. And people don't feel like they can talk about these issues until they understand the names. But not even understanding that they don't understand these identity markers is a huge hindrance.
Absolutely.
So Marcus, I don't know, maybe if you want to join this conversation here. Since you're talking about restoring higher education. Oh, I had to, Marcus, I think you can turn off your own.
Yeah, I can.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Well, this is something that we've been thinking a lot about, Marcus and I. So I don't know if you want to chime in here, Marcus.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bis, and thanks so much, Shauneen, especially for your, I think it was 6 steps of curriculum here that you shared. If I counted it correctly, I might have been wrong here, a little bit off with the count, and I like the really practical aspect of it. I mean, going to the land, interacting with the land. And it also tells me that this is, in terms of understanding what land is. And this brings me to the question that also some of my students, or I've discussed with my students. So at the end, one student then asked me, so does it mean that we have to go all back to the nature? How can we do this? Especially given the increased urbanity. And so what would be your answer to that? I mean, I could share my answer too, but I don't know. I'm more interested in your answer, of course, or the student would, if I don't think the student is here today, but what would be your answer to this distinction?
I think the more that we spend time with land and water, the more it opens up our hearts and our spirit to hearing differently. And it allows us to create that space within us for reciprocity with land. From that co-learning, the deep listening practice, and to shift our thinking about land as possession to perhaps our responsibilities with land. And I'm thinking land and water and non-human others, the other life forms, including the plants, including the trees, all of those things. And when we begin to relate differently with non-human others, it creates a shift in us, and it allows us perhaps to really remember ancestral knowledges, or to get a sense of them, and to start to engage differently with land. A couple words for me popped into my head earlier today in preparation for this session, and one of them had to do with really restoration and restoring that ancestral relationship with land in a different way. And it can be as simple as planting a garden, eating whole food, harvest, where it came from, about tending the plants. Like here, we get overrun with Scotch broom. And so my colleague, Jeff Corntassel, takes the students out and they clear some of the broom just to, because it's such an invasive plant. And in that way, they're reminding themselves that there's things they can do, right? That will help them to feel that deeper sense of connection and to work with it in a really good way, in a way that takes us back to those original ideas of Wekotowin and Wetaskiwin.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question from one of our participants who expresses their gratitude for your sharing of the stories in an Indigenous language that I don't want to mispronounce. So I would welcome the person to turn off their mic if they feel comfortable doing so. They write, I deeply relate when you said that settlers believe that they need to access our culture and cultural practices before they can understand us. As a Two-Spirit Mi'kmaq person in a predominantly white program and a TA for an Indigenous studies course, this is something I feel subjected to regularly. How have you navigated those conversations in a good way, protecting your spirit?
I didn't always do it well. Let me start with that, because you do feel this obligation that we're here in these classes. I'm visible. I'm one of the few Indigenous people in some of my programs, and you do feel like you have a responsibility to share what you know with people. Just because if we don't, it feels like nope, they're not going to get it anywhere else. Over time, though, and with the greater access to materials just through Google, I started to remind people that there's reciprocity in this relationship. And too often we're called on to be the giver at the same time as being students. And that's just not fair. It's not fair to put us into those positions. Kind of the first month into my PhD, I think I was up to here with requests to help other people learn stuff. And my committee members said to me, we really appreciate that you share all of this work about anti-racism and anti-oppression and Indigenous people, and we really like it. And I said, I know, but I used to get paid for this back home. And then I was kind of taken aback that I actually said that out loud. And then I just, in talking with them, they realized that unfair assumptions that they had made about what I could bring to the table always, all the time, freely. So they paid my tuition for the rest of my PhD. So, there's some negotiation perhaps is a strategy. With undergraduate students, I really caution them not to fall into that trap, but to call on faculty to do some of their own research and to attend the workshops so that they can build their capacity to take on this work. Because as an undergrad, you're still trying to find your feet, and that's not fair expectation that some folks place on them. So I'd like to protect them a bit more. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have an anonymous question. In addition to learning about Indigenous communities through academics, Google, etc., how can we go beyond to learn about the rich culture and stories that Indigenous communities have to offer? I've often felt education isn't complete until you're out of the classroom and exposed to the real world, relating yourself to the things you've learned. How should we, as outsiders, include this approach when learning about Indigenous communities?
My advice to teachers, especially, and to teacher candidates that I've worked mostly with, is that they need to start filling up their backpack with a variety of informal resources. And those might include some of the local stories in the wayfinding around their cities and around their communities. So that's a good starting place. The second place for me is to really go for a walk with a dog and listen to that podcast by Pam Pometer, because she's awesome and she's really powerful voice, and reference it in your conversations with people, because it's not enough just to know something. You actually have an obligation to share it. Like, if we want change and reform to happen in society, more settlers need to be calling more settlers out on things, and they need to be calling them in for the conversations that will hopefully change their thinking about, Indigenous people, contemporary issues, and in particular about land and resources.
I like that active allyship is having your learning be in connection with reality. It's not only about potentially learning in place-based environments and connecting with Indigenous communities. It's doing the kind of activism to support those communities that is just as valid of an intersection between theory and praxis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great.
And there's no age limit to it. Like, I knew this woman from Regina. She was a fantastic ally. She was really awesome. And she would travel down to Phoenix every year for about 5 or 6 months. And she started podcasting. She was like 80. And what she was doing is she was reading, the literature, and she was listening to the podcast, and she was sense making for herself, and then sharing her learning journey with her family and friends. So she contacted me and she just said, FYI, I just thought I'd let you know, I have like over 200 people following me and listening in on my podcast. And I was like, fantastic, right? Because that's probably 200 people I wasn't going to reach. So it's wonderful when people take that up.
Yeah, and bringing other settlers on your learning journey, I think, is pretty profound. Because this is one of the big moments of realization that I had when I wanted to be an ally and figure out what that meant as a teacher, while not trying to take over and be the voice of Indigenous people, but that it was my responsibility to step up and teach other settlers. And that's not to say I only have settlers in my class, but to take the burden of some of that teaching off, because settler colonialism is the system that I benefit from. It's the one that my people built. And so that's the education that is my responsibility. And we're getting in the chat a thank you for your answer about protecting your spirit. I relate to not always being able to do it in a good way, but in a way that just comes out. Yes, I relate to that, not in this context, but in the way that things just come out.
Yes.
As I move through my master's and potentially into a PhD, it is powerful to see other Indigenous folks stand their ground in a good way for themselves and the coming generations and community. And so, yeah, I have to second that you doing this work really models how this work can and should be done in a really powerful way. And then turning back to our Q&A from a colleague in my department, thank you so much for your insight. How do you feel about settlers teaching Indigenous history, culture, and language? Yeah, where is the boundary there that settlers should not cross?
Well, I think the one thing that is really important to note is that it's our shared history. And there's a really big chunk of it that has been erased. So it's to tell a more truthful history would be the strategy, and that's everybody's work, right? I appreciate my allies that I've worked with who are settlers, who are working alongside language teachers to create dictionaries and to create access to understanding the mechanics of language. So for me, like I've always admired the linguists who've worked in allyship with Indigenous language speakers. And I think the great balance for me was seeing how the faculty worked together at First Nations University of Canada to do very good things for Indigenous languages from two very different practices. So yes, I appreciate my allies in all of those areas. The other piece though is that settler decolonization cannot continue to be the work of Indigenous people. We need more settlers to take up that leadership work, and you don't need my permission to do that. Like you could actually just do it, right? As Biza is doing. I really just think your pedagogy is incredible. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing so that I don't have to. Like I'd love to get going on some resurgence work over here, right? Something that is going to lift up my community members, that's going to inspire them in ways that will just really advance us, so that we know in 7 more generations what it means to be Nehiyawan and to hold that so dearly, and not have to do the settler decolonization, the anti-racism anymore. I want the good, healthy, spiritually beautiful, lifting up stuff. That's where I want my career to go.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I read once how the characterization of this problem that we're both settlers and Indigenous peoples are both colonial people. Just one is the colonizer and one is the colonized, and that sort of helped to destabilize this idea of whose responsibility it was to do this teaching, because we're all colonial people. Caroline, thanks you for that response. Now turning to our next question, John writes, I also wanted to extend gratitude to you for your sharing today. I grew up in Williams Lake / 100 Mile House in a very small town in BC. While we were not formally taught in our education systems about Indigenous culture, knowledge, belief systems, I was fortunate to learn snippets through friendships that I created in my childhood. I absolutely loved your mention of ancestral knowledge, and I love the mention of the Lakota and the what stuff when forgive my spelling, forgive my pronunciation. Well, I will practice your assignment if I see and I am well in nature. It was very moving to just thinking about it. So thank you for that.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And I really do encourage it. It does shift something, and give yourself permission to feel the feelings that arise because of the shift. It's quite wonderful. It's a very, very good activity to do. And it's not mine. I didn't dream it up. It was my friend Christine Webster's.
As part of our course, my students do learning journal assignments, and I might borrow this and ask them to do this work, because I'm still learning how to make students connect with their land on a practical level, because I'm stuck in like Eurocentric models of education where we're just in our head, and for some reason we don't feel that our bodies can do the work of knowledge as well.
And it has to, like, we carry so much of the trauma of colonization in our bodies. We carry fear and anger and guilt and shame in so many different locations. Like, people will often gesture, you know, to their heart space, their throat space, or their stomach space when they have those emotions tied up with not knowing. So, like, think about it a year ago when the Kamloops residential school graveyard site was discovered, right? And think about how often you heard, "I just didn't know," right? And all of those feelings of anger, guilt, and shame that emerge because of that are embodied. And so we actually have to work with our bodies to try and release some of that stuff, that the heaviness of ongoing oppression, right? And we have to find new ways to be creative in moving forward. I shared with you the other day that one of my favorite assignments to do with a group of students I had a couple years ago was I asked them, what does the settler reformation look like? What would that movement look like? What's on your banners? What's on your playlist? Who's your speakers? Where are you meeting? What's on your t-shirt? Like, what's going on? Like, how would that look? Because students in the course often said, how can we be supportive allies of Indigenous people? And I'm like, folks, you got enough work here, right? You're going to have to deal with the settler colonialism piece too. You can't just be allies to Indigenous people. You got to take care of your own stuff too. And what does that look like, and where does that happen? So that ended up being a real fun activity.
Yeah, one that has inspired me as well. After that conversation, I continued thinking about that. What's the social media campaign for tearing down settler colonialism?
I love it. It's a great question.
Yeah, exactly. So hold on to that, students, because we will have a creative assignment at the end of the semester. Okay, and turning to the chat, John writes, you mentioned settlers being able to help in the process of decolonization. How might a settler begin this process of assisting?
I think starting with self and really beginning to disrupt those notions of materiality, individualism, competitive corporatism, like land as possession, all of those kinds of things kind of need to be disrupted at the onset in order to choose a different way of relating, not only with Indigenous people, but with land and non-human others. And that's always been the kind of my first strategy, is start there and then move forward. Follow your lines of inquiry. So if you're unaware of the child welfare system, start doing your reading on that, start learning more about it. If you're unaware of the past system, for example, go watch the film and pull it up online because it's free, and learn more about how that limited Indigenous progress, how it kept dependency open. And then take a look at what would it mean to be in a different relationship with Indigenous people and land. What would that really look like for settlers? I think that's their next big task, is to imagine a different kind of relationship, one that doesn't rely on our dispossession. Arthur Manuel talks about how, First Nations people in Canada, we occupy 0.02% of the land, but yet corporations and development projects can't seem to go around us, right? They can't find a way. The only thing they can do, in which they assert, is running straight through our lands, and they're limited as they are. Why? I'd love settlers to be asking those questions to corporations, to investors, to politicians. Why is it you couldn't just go around, right?
Yeah. And then to bring those questions to their other courses, to prompt that conversation, because most of our participants are university students. So to bring these questions that we're learning and that they're learning and from their reading to other courses, and spark conversation on behalf of the Indigenous communities that might not, unfortunately, be represented in those spaces. Okay, we have, thank you all. I'm grateful for the learning you allowed me to do here today. Unfortunately, I have to leave. Thank you. And then John wrote, thank you. That was great. So, and I think that concludes our hour, which means I can make it promptly to my next class as well. So thank you to you for joining us today from Victoria. I look forward to hopefully having you in person, because we're talking about bodies and embodiment and what it means to be present and on land and share space. And I miss that, especially when we have these conversations. The moment we start talking about land and place virtually, it feels different, but and we feel that in our body too. So
Yeah.
hopefully soon. In the meantime, we'll be connecting again via email. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to all our participants for the great questions and dialogue. And thank you, Marcus, for joining us up in the panelist area. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Take care, folks. Go outside and play.
Shauneen, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Good day, everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.